Serafino Grumblebeard was hardly the sort of gnome you'd expect to cause a national catastrophe, especially not one involving vegetables. He was unremarkable in height, even by gnome standards, and slightly pudgy around the midsection. His beard, a frizzy ginger spiral, sprouted from his chin as though it had a tendency to hover just off his chest. He wore a perennially bewildered expression as if perpetually pondering the mysteries of No, Serafino was not the type to invite calamity. Yet that is precisely what happened one late spring when his garden burst forth with vegetables the size of automobiles. He had been tending his modest plot of land for decades. Peas, carrots, marrows, and pumpkins were his specialties. He knew his soils and fertilizers as intimately as any connoisseur knows wine or cheese. But this year, he felt an itch of experimental curiosity. Maybe it was the result of reading too many almanacs or listening to too many sensational gardening tales down at the local watering hole, or perhaps the blame lay in an inconspicuously labeled sack of miraculous growth formula he picked up at the traveling wizard's market. Either way, as he raked the soil, laid down seeds, and scattered the suspicious powder among the rows, he thought to himself, "A little extra growth never hurt anyone." In the early stages, everything looked normal. Tiny green sheets peeked out of the damp earth. He carefully watered them by hand, humming a lullaby for the seedlings' benefit. Every morning, he measured their growth with a small wooden ruler, and every evening he tucked them in with a light sprinkling of water and a liberal sprinkling of compliments. Gnomes believed that whispered sweet words could encourage plants to thrive. He'd say things like, "Oh, my dear carrots, how bold and orange you shall be," or, "Marrows, you are already becoming so plump." Then he'd top it off with an overly dramatic, "Grow big and strong for me, dear friends." The real trouble began about a month in, when he woke before dawn and heard a low rumbling outside. At first he thought it might be a passing herd of trolls, but the sound was too steady, too localized. He grabbed a lantern and ventured out into the gloom. There, in the flickering glow, he saw his entire carrot patch trembling with unnatural vigor. The leaves undulated like a wave as though an invisible hand were shaking them violently from below. Serafino watched numbers swirl in his mind. How could the carrot stems be nearly 3 feet tall in just a single month? Come morning, those carrots broke the surface in their quest to show off their dramatic sizes. Their tops rapidly rose to chest height. One carrot was so thick around that Serafino couldn't wrap his arms around it. Sometime after midday, he noted this in his diary. A snapping sound raked through the garden, and the monstrous carrot, apparently too big for its own greenery, rolled onto its side, flattening several rows of peas. His eyebrows shot up in horror. "Oh dear," he muttered. As the days progressed, everything else in the garden began to follow suit. Beets as wide as cartwheels, marrows that resembled sleek convertibles in shape and size, and pumpkins that could have easily doubled as cottages for a large family of trolls. His yard, once a tidy vegetable haven, had become a forest of gargantuan produce. Wrangling them was out of the question. Each was heavier than a dozen of him combined. He soon found himself constructing makeshift wooden supports and scaffolds to keep the dangerously large marrows from rolling off into the street. It became a structural engineering problem rather than mere gardening. 3 days later, the neighbors began to notice. One morning, Griselda Bumbleroot, an elderly gnome from 2 houses down, popped by to say hello. As soon as she stepped into Serafino's yard, her spectacles fogged with shock. "Good heavens, Serafino," she screeched, nearly jumping out of her slippers at the sprawling carrot that manifested like a bright orange submarine across the lawn. "Was there some sort of carnival act here that I missed?" Before Serafino could respond, the monstrous beat behind him let out a groan, dislodging part of the fence. With an ominous creak, the fence gave way entirely, and the beat rolled right onto Griselda's prized geraniums next door. She threw her arms up in despair and let out a wail that drifted across the neighborhood. "This is an outrage! My geraniums have been squashed by a giant root vegetable." I am so sorry. I had no idea they'd grow this large," Serafino stammered, trying to push the beat back, but he was dwarfed by the vegetable's tremendous girth. Word spread. Soon, other neighbors were arriving under the guise of curiosity, clutching pitchforks and rakes, possibly in case more produce decided to invade their yards. The chaotic scene was frequently interrupted by loud thumps, cracks, or a rolling vegetable that would flatten yet another hapless flower bed. A radish the size of a wheelbarrow had already ended up in Mr. Tundlefoot's koi pond, and the poor fish desperately tried to navigate around the new addition. Desperate to stop further destruction, Serafino took to calling in any kind of professional help he could think of. First, he tried the local landscaper, whose job, ironically, had been made impossible by the fact that these vegetables simply defied normal horticultural procedures. Next, he called the village blacksmith to see if forging metal braces might contain the produce. The blacksmith arrived, took one look at the monstrous pumpkins, then promptly fell backwards off his cart in shock. Inevitably, word spread to the mayor of the nearby gnomish town of Oakmoss Glen, who called an emergency meeting. Soon after, a letter arrived on Serafino's doorstep that said, in unequivocally stern language, "We demand you bring your garden under control or face the consequences." Between trembling hands and watery eyes, Serafino read the letter half a dozen times. He felt a swirl of guilt. He never intended to unleash a vegetable apocalypse. He loved his neighbors, and in his simpler days, he'd have been the first to offer them baskets of carrots and peas. Now, even though he wished he could share, one carrot alone would take up the full dimensions of anyone's dining room, making any attempt at generosity not only impractical, but borderline dangerous. Various attempts at containment followed. Serafino thought, surely we can cut them down to size, but everyday gardening tools just weren't up to the task. Axes made small dents in the carrots, but never cut through them entirely. With comedic frustration, a group of local gnomes formed a line on the biggest marrow and tried to saw through, only to see their saw blades snap after a few passes. It turned out that the interior of these vegetables was dense, almost rock solid. In discovering that, a blackened suspicion formed in Serafino's mind. Maybe the miraculous growth formula was laced with a strong magical property that wasn't just making the vegetables huge, but also harder than typical produce. The fiasco reached new heights when the largest pumpkin abruptly broke free of its wooden braces one midday. It tumbled down the street like a runaway boulder, cracking the cobblestones in its path. Neighbors fled their homes, squealing in alarm, as the colossal pumpkin narrowly missed flattening an unlucky chicken coop. The giant gourd ultimately came to rest against the local tavern, leaving a massive round imprint in the building's side. Shocked gnomes streamed out to see half their tavern's facade caved in by an orange monstrosity. After that, it was clear that pleas for help would come from more official channels. Soon, a small but highly trained squad of dwarven engineers arrived from the next kingdom over. They wore sturdy boots and carried spools of steel cable, pulleys, and portable forging gear. They surveyed the vegetables with stoic determination. Their leader, an imposing dwarf named Grelda Stonegear, rubbed her calloused hands together. "We will bind them, anchor them, and if they keep rolling away, we will build a fortress around them." The dwarves took their duties seriously. For 2 days, an entire rigging operation took place. They hammered anchor points into the ground around each giant vegetable and then wrapped thick steel cables around them, adjusting the tension with massive wrenches. It was so elaborate that from above, the yard resembled a web of glinting metal strung between a menagerie of monstrous produce. Serafino tried to be helpful by offering them tea and fresh cinnamon bread, but the dwarves scarcely paused in their efforts. Under the dwarves' watchful eyes, the vegetables stayed put for a while. Then a bizarre, hissing whine emerged from the cabbage patch. With wide-eyed horror, the dwarfs discovered that each giant cabbage was exuding an unidentifiable gas. Moments later, in a surreal chain reaction, the cable snapped off the first cabbage with a rending screech. The tension from the cable whipped dangerously through the air, slicing a chunk off a nearby fence post. Grelda yelled, "Duck!" and the dwarfs all dove to the ground. Another cable parted, then another, until the entire rigging system disintegrated into flailing steel serpents. One snapped into a dwarven catapult truck, sending a plume of dust into the air. When the chaos subsided, the dwarves realized that whatever had been pumped into these vegetables, Serafino's infamous growth formula, made them not only big and dense, but also strangely active. The vegetables almost breathed, as though they had a life of their own. This was beyond the dwarves' engineering kin. It was wizard territory. Serafino, distraught but determined to set matters right, trekked to the traveling wizards market in search of a cure. The market was a flamboyant festival of swirling colored lights, illusions of dancing pixies, and stalls selling everything from bottled mermaid tears to freeze-dried phoenix feathers. It was here that Serafino first obtained the growth formula. He now hoped to track down its maker. He wandered from stall to stall, inquiring about the small burlap sack with the label of a star-laden mortar and pestle. None of the hawkers or peddlers seemed to remember selling such a thing. One wizard responded, "Are you sure it wasn't labeled in draconic script? If so, that's definitely not for me." After searching for hours, he slumped onto a bench near a stall showcasing a giant's goblet, a 100-gallon wine glass rumored to have once belonged to a cloud. His shoulders sagged in despair. Then, from a corner stall, he heard a voice call out, "Psst, you look like a gnome in trouble. Care for some advice?" Serafino looked up to see a hooded figure with a long, thin mustache curling out from beneath the hood, beckoning him with a crooked finger. Though anxious, Serafino trudged over, hoping for a legitimate lead. The figure's stall was cluttered with rotating crystal mobiles and potions bubbling away in apparatuses. "I heard you're looking for a remedy to something I might have concocted," the figure said in a hushed voice. Yes, the growth formula. I recall mixing a batch that might have had a special property or two. Apologies, dear gnome. Let's just say my labeling system can be a tad experimental." Serafino stammered. "Well, why would you make something so dangerous?" The hooded figure passively shrugged. It wasn't supposed to be that strong. Something in your soil must have catalyzed an unforeseen reaction. A potent synergy." He pulled out a small corked vial. "This is the counter agent. It will reduce them back to normal size. Probably," he paused. "It's a bit delicate. You must properly mix it with water, then drip it onto the vegetables at intervals according to the lunar cycle. If done incorrectly, well," the wizard's mustache twitched ominously. "You don't want to know." Serafino clutched the vial the way a drowning man clings to a plank of driftwood. He knows it's likely his best and only hope, but still full of fear that it might break or fail him at a crucial moment. Carefully paying the wizard 6 gold coins plus a tip in hopes of ensuring no ill will, Serafino returned home at top speed. The moment he arrived, he found the scene more alarming than ever. One enormous corget had apparently outgrown its supports and was pressing dangerously against Griselda Bumbleroot's house, like a stubborn wedge trying to excavate a new door. A tomato had rolled over the fence and created a crater in the street, which a gang of rowdy goblins was treating like a carnival slide. The entire settlement seemed poised on the brink of fleeing or forming a produce riot. Quickly, Serafino grabbed a large watering can, filled it with water from the well, and added precisely 3 drops of the wizard's counteragent. Then he began a systematic approach. 1 drop on the beet, wait for a sign, then 1 drop on the carrot, wait for a sign. He followed the instructions to the letter. For a while, nothing happened. Serafino worried that perhaps he'd misapplied it, or that the water from his well wasn't the right temperature. He thought about the medieval superstitions surrounding partial lunar phases, but the wizard's instructions didn't mention anything about waxing or waning. Just as he was about to break into tears from frustration, he noticed the giant pumpkin that had smashed the tavern was quivering. Slowly, it seemed to unravel. Like a hot air balloon letting out helium, the orange orb shrank from gargantuan to merely massive, and then, with a hiccup, it deflated to the size of a typical, if rather large, harvest pumpkin. A cheer rose up from the onlookers, who in their curiosity had gathered at a safe distance behind improvised barricades. After seeing the success of the pumpkin, Serafino systematically dropped the mixture onto the other mammoth vegetables. One by one, they wobbled, trembled, and shrank. The giant carrots deflated until they were modest bunches. The monstrous marrows withered back to normal size. The boulder-sized beets lost their incredible girth. Within the hour, the entire yard and the street and the neighbor's pond looked much more like a typical harvest scene, where once a giant radish bobbed. A normal, though slightly oversized radish floated in the koi pond. Serafino let out an enormous sigh of relief, dropping onto his rear in the middle of the now littered but decidedly normal-sized garden. The people around cheered and approached cautiously, tapping and poking the now harmless vegetables. With the immediate crisis averted, some even joked about how shameful it was to miss out on a giant salad, which brought about a wave of laughter to dispel the tension. The dwarves, though they'd lost their precious cables in the fiasco, graciously chalked it up as a valuable lesson in magical infiltration into horticulture. Grelda Stonegear clapped Serafino on the back. "Well done, gnome. Whatever that wizard gave you did the trick." In the following days, the cleanup began in earnest. Fences had to be rebuilt, the tavern's wall needed a fresh facade, and Griselda Bumbleroot's poor geraniums needed replanting. Serafino offered to reimburse every neighbor for their troubles. He shared the newly normalized vegetables as well, distributing beets, carrots, and pumpkins as a peace offering and symbol of apology. He even tried to salvage what was left of the monstrous produce to donate to local soup kitchens once it was scaled down. The villagers accepted his apologies, though some side-eyed him whenever he wandered near the garden store. After a few days, however, life settled back to a relaxed normal. Birds chirped, the smell of fresh-tilled earth returned, and the occasional muttering about the great giant veggie crisis turned into a half-joking reference for local gossip. Serafino promised himself he would never dabble in unknown growth formulas again. Still, he had a bit of scientific curiosity that refused to be utterly extinguished. On quiet afternoons, he would occasionally glance at the remains of the miracle fertilizer bag tucked away in his shed. His rational mind would scream, "No, don't even think about it." But a tiny corner of his gardener's heart whispered, what if that formula could be harnessed with the wizard's anti-growth mixture for something beneficial, like bigger yields that still fit in a wheelbarrow? For now, though, he was content with relatively normal produce, thankful that no more property damage claims were arriving in his mailbox. Weeks later, everyone exhaled in relief when the mayor announced that all fines imposed on Serafino had been lifted. The mayor, a wise old gnome with a stern face and twinkling eyes, even visited him personally. "Young fellow," he rumbled, "we're glad this fiasco is over, but I must ask, is it safe now? No more surprise gargantuan gourds, I hope?" Serafino blushed. "Perfectly safe, Mr. Mayor. I plan to stick to normal seeds from now on. My days of untested potions and questionable powders are behind me." "Good," said the mayor, tipping his hat before strolling away with an air of measured contentment. A day or so later, rumors circulated that a festival was being planned to remember the bizarre event in a lighthearted way. After all, Oak Moss Glen had never witnessed something that garnered so much attention, nor had it attracted so many outside spectators. Merchants saw an opportunity in the fiasco. Imagining giant carrot plush toys, I survived the great Veggie crisis sweatshirts, and specialized souvenir seeds, which promised normal, safe produce, of course. Unsurprisingly, once a bit of time had passed, the townspeople were ready to celebrate the near disaster as a colorful part of their history. Before long, a date for the Great Gnome Harvest and Giant Vegetable Jamboree was set. Tables lined the main street of Oak Moss Glen, stacked with bread, cheese, pastries, and, of course, a bounty of normal, newly harvested vegetables. Musicians filled the air with jaunty tunes, while costumed children paraded around dressed as carrots, peas in a pod, and pumpkins. A few comedic reenactments were performed, gnomish actors rolling oversized foam pumpkins through a stage set that looked like cardboard houses. At the festival's official opening, the mayor made a grand speech about the community's resilience and the importance of responsible horticulture. Everyone clapped as Serafino, somewhat shyly, stepped onto the small wooden platform to make a speech of his own. Clearing his throat awkwardly, he looked out at the crowd. They watched him expectantly. He recognized a mixture of the scowls and smirks that had characterized the crisis. Some folks found the incident funny in hindsight, while others still remembered the damage to their fences or their geranium beds, but all were here to celebrate and support a new chapter for the town. "Fellow gnomes and neighbors," Serafino began, voice trembling slightly, "today we stand together, relieved that we aren't overshadowed by monstrous pumpkins or flattened by giant root vegetables. I never intended to cause chaos and destruction, though that is exactly what happened. I wish I could say a simple sorry suffices, but, well, I have something better than an apology. I offer you the biggest harvest celebration we've ever had. He introduced the large baskets behind him, beautifully displayed perfectly normal vegetables grown by Serafino in the weeks since the crisis. The crowd clapped in delight as he continued. I vow to keep my garden free of untested potions, or at the very least, I'll consult a wizard first if I feel too adventurous. The comedic drama group then performed a short comedic sketch in which an unlucky gardener tries to woo a giant marrow into staying in a greenhouse. The marrow, anthropomorphized by a costumed actor who wobbled humorously, ended up rolling away and flattening a fence prop. The whole audience erupted in hysterics. Serafino had to wipe away tears of laughter, relieved to see the comedic side of things now that the real threat was gone. After the speeches and skits, the festival turned into a full-blown feast. Long picnic tables were laden with stews and pies. A highlight was the very large veggie soup, a hearty dish made with leftovers of the partial giant produce that had returned to normal size but was still on the larger side, as though nature decided to keep a bit of the magic around. It fed half the village, was succulent and sweet, and ironically matched the humor of the entire fiasco. Griselda Bumbleroot, once outraged about her squashed geraniums, approached Serafino with a friendly smile. "That's the best soup I've ever had," she grinned, all forgiven now that she'd seen his genuine remorse and tasted the culinary benefits of the oversized vegetables. "I do think you owe me some new geranium seeds, though," she teased. "Of course," Serafino replied, sharing a polite laugh. "I have them right in my shed regular, definitely non-magic geranium seeds, I promise." As the sun began to set, lanterns were strung across the streets, bathing the festival in a soft golden glow. Gnomes danced in circles or sat on wooden benches swapping tall tales. The dwarfs lingered as well, sharing tankards of ale with the townsfolk while recounting the story of the time cables couldn't even hold down the produce. Children ran around with carrot-shaped balloons, yelling excitedly about who got to pretend to be the giant vegetable next. Eventually, Serafino slipped away to stand near his garden's edge. He watched the festival from a short distance, a mixture of relief and pride glowing on his face. He knew the memory of the giant veggie crisis would stick to him forever like burrs on a rabbit's fur, but he was also relieved to see the crisis turn into a comedic anecdote, something that could unite neighbors around a fresh harvest meal. Rather than remain a wedge of animosity, the next morning, as he walked through his now normal rows of vegetables, he stooped down to examine them. A twinge of gratitude replaced the old obsessive desire for the biggest, boldest yields. He learned a valuable lesson about moderation, caution, and the unpredictable consequences of magical meddling. Perhaps in the future, he would experiment in safer ways. Maybe just one small row with one small pinch of a different fertilizer to see if it helped the spinach leaves. But for now, he gazed lovingly at the vibrant greens and oranges of carrots that were exactly the right size, and he found peace in that simplicity. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and he imagined them whispering, "We'll keep you on your toes, Serafino." He smiled at the thought. Despite all the madness, there was beauty tucked away in these living things, whose gentle presence brightened his world each day. Instead of fearful respect or anxious regret, he now felt a renewed, calm appreciation for nature's capacity to surprise and delight. He also found amusement in the leftover giant's goblet seeds that the traveling wizard had given him as a parting gift. The wizard claimed these seeds would expand to spectacular heights, but only in illusions, never physically. Serafino kept them on his shelf, occasionally turning them in his hands, reminded that gardening always holds a bit of mystery. Sometimes that mystery yields a bumper crop. Sometimes it produces vegetables capable of toppling taverns, but in either case it offers stories worth sharing. And so ended the most astonishing, destructive, and simultaneously hilarious garden season Oakmoss Glen had ever known. Gnomes, dwarves, and goblins alike would recount the tale for years to come, each spinning it with new exaggerations. They told of how the carrots grew so tall they tickled the clouds, or how a giant radish nearly rolled off into the next kingdom. But Serafino, for his part, remembered the events with humility and a twinge of pride at having, albeit accidentally, pushed the boundaries of what a gnome gardener could accomplish, even if it was a boundary that might have better remained unexplored. From that day forward, whenever a new gnome asked about renting a plot in Oak Moss Glen, the locals would smirk and say, "We have to warn you, keep an eye on your fertilizer. You wouldn't want a repeat of the great giant veggie crisis." Then they'd proceed to chuckle and share the story, always ensuring they got the important parts right. How a small, unassuming gnome with a big heart and bigger ideas discovered that sometimes, in the world of gardening, bigger isn't always better, even when it makes for one unforgettable harvest.